Okay, so there's a few more tools that I want to eventually get into: the ladder tool, the handrail tool, and the stair tool. But those are kind of more. They have a lot more settings and they're standalone. And before we get to that, I want to get on some modifications that can be made to steel members individually. Since we're on the topic of inserting steel shapes and whatnot. Because these are going to be pretty, critical when you're compiling your models together. The first thing I want to start off with is coping. Coping is essentially cutting a beam, cutting the ends of a beam, or a structural member in a way that it notches around another object. I'm going to start by, I have a rectangle here. I'm going to start by putting some wide flanges in, just like some 8/18s. If you select a polyline, it will place a beam on every segment. So that's what we've done here. Let's go ahead and select these and drag them out to the edges to make the long beams our through members of what could be a platform or a skid base of sorts. I'm also going to erase my polyline that's there because I don't want it to get in the way. I'm also going to change my line type scaling so it's easier to see the center lines from far away. Okay, so now that we've got this created, let's go ahead and copy a couple of these beams. This platform is 10 feet long, so let's go ahead and copy these things over 2.5 feet, 5 feet, 7'6". And then let's do another one right in the center. And this isn't meant to be super realistic. You probably wouldn't do anything. Actually, you know what? For the center beam, we'll do a channel. No, it's fine. It's fine. We'll leave it like it is. Okay. So, yeah, that's fine. This is just for demonstration purposes anyways. All right, so we've got our primary beams, our secondary beams, or our tertiary beam. Or this can be the tertiary, secondary, and these can be tertiary. So let's do it like this. We're going to cope. Okay, and what coping is going to do is it's going to cut the one beam around the other beam. The way to do that is you select the beam that you want to cut, the one you want to be coped first. So it says select objects to cope, one object. Okay? Well, it says to found, but it's one group, one CADWorx object. Now it says select coping boundaries. Basically, what are we going to cut this thing around? What is it attaching to that we're going to cut around? We're going to cut around this beam. And what it's going to do is it's going to cut the top flange back and it's going to cut the bottom flange back so that they are just lined up with the flange of the other beam. And it's also going to cut the web back so that the web is lined up with the web of this beam. It's going to ask if I want a welded or bolted cope. First, we're going to do a welded cope so that it's nice and neat. When you do this, you can see now how this beam is cut back. In fact, I'll pull it out. And you can see how it's been cut back. You can see that the web lines up with the web of the other beam. And the flanges line up with the other flanges, especially because these are all the same size. Had these not been the same size, the flanges would look different. In fact, I'll put a different size over here. Let's do something larger, like a 1022. Something heavier, like a 1033. Okay, so we'll use that for this side. Let's do a bolted cope next. So we're going to do the same operation. We're going to select the objects we want to cope. And we're going to hit enter, and then we're going to select the object we want to use as a coping boundary. This time when it asks us for bolted, we're going to select bolted. And you're going to notice that what it does is it provides a gap around everything. It provides a 1/2 inch gap between the flanges and a 1/2 inch gap between the webs. And even on the underside, a 1/2 inch gap. I'll go into a different visual style so you can see how that cope actually works. Now keep in mind, to save on geometry, nothing in these corners is rounded, so no actual round coping. Also, your actual cope may not look exactly like this. Your flange may not come in so far, or if you have a full depth stiffener or a full depth shear tab, or angles that protrude out, you may have a channel that's just cut flush with the flange. Either way, you still want your center line to go all the way to the center no matter what. Doesn't matter how it's actually connected, you want this to go all the way. So when you're doing things like welded structures and skids, you're going to want to use that welded cope. When you're doing bolted, like stick-built structures, you're going to want to use that bolted cope. You can bolt multiple members at once. So I'm going to make everything here bolted. I'm going to do a cope. I'm going to select all these lines. I can just select them individually or use a fence line. And then I want to select my coping boundary. I want to cope to this, and I want to cope to this. And I'm going to choose a bolted cope. And what it did is it coped all of these beams at the same time using this beam and this beam as a coping boundary. So they've been coped, and they stay that way. It remembers that orientation. It remembers that because of auto cope. Auto cope is a toggle that basically says remember this cope. Okay, don't forget that cope. All right. Well, we still have the problem of these beams intersecting each other. Well, this is where coping does something really cool, where it will segment crossing beams. So what you do is you select the object you want to cope. In this case, the object I want to cut. So I select this is my object I want to cope. Then I select the ones I want to use it to cope as boundaries. I want this one and this one so I can cope the ends, but I want these because what I want to do is I want it to break it up in the center and then cope that as well. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to choose bolted cope. And what you see now is it's taken that one beam that I've chosen to cope and used these as its coping boundaries and broken that beam up into segments. That being said, something to keep in mind as well is that once you've created a coping boundary and it remembers that coping boundary, anything you do will maintain that cope. So if I take this beam and I want to extend it past, it's going to remember that coping boundary. And when I do that, it's going to split the new beam. So say I want to erase this one and I extend it through. It's going to clip it again. Oh, it didn't in this case. That's probably one thing I should warn about. Did I turn my auto cope off? It's on. So that's one thing I should probably warn too, is sometimes CADWorx will provide unexpected behavior. And I'm not even joking about this. There's going to be things that you swear you played it by the rules and it still didn't do what you expected to. We know that this is a coping boundary. We know that this is a coping boundary. And you can see that when I extend this line, previously it cut the beam and now it's not. We go back. Maybe it's because I erased that one beam. And we're still getting erroneous coping behavior. So I'll recope. Cope here and here and here. Oops. Let's cope here to this and this. Do a bolted cope. And there it splits it. And now it splits it again. So you may occasionally get some erroneous behavior like that. Important to note as well, if sometimes, and this may or may not work in this instance, but if you copy a beam up, let's say I copy a coped beam, and I go to stretch this out. This one didn't do it. However, I have had beams in the past. Will this do it? See how it's not coping anymore. So I'm not sure what's causing the unexpected behavior because that cope should be maintained. Whenever you do this, that cope should be maintained between here and here. And then when you copy up, what will happen is sometimes you'll copy a beam up and extend it past, and it will cut it. It will cut that beam as if the cope were still there. Because what it's essentially doing is making this imaginary cutting plane. So, again, keep that kind of stuff in mind. You can see how the cope worked on this side. The beam went through. The bottom flange wasn't coped like this one was because they're different depth beams. Coping has some things that can work to your advantage, definitely, just as long as you keep in mind what's going on with the behavior of the cope. If you need to reset a beam, you can just double click it And if you have auto coping on, a thing will happen. If you turn auto coping off, where you toggle it off and you double click it and hit OK, it will reset the beam. So let's see. What was I looking for? Convert solid. Yeah. You can try to do a convert solid. Sometimes if you hit convert solid, it kind of resets the properties in the cope of the beam. That's this one here. Again, modification panel. I wasn't going to go over that later, but I guess it's a good idea to go now since we're getting rid of copes. If you want to get rid of that cope, just convert solid. And now you should be able to do whatever you got to do like you did before. So, yeah, that's coping in a nutshell. Later, I'll go over some more advanced coping when you need to make copes that aren't normally available with steel.